All right, well, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. Really happy you're here with us this week. This week, we're going to take on another explorer and discoverer from the Age of Discovery. And this is a man who came shortly after Christopher Columbus. If you didn't get a chance to watch our Christopher Columbus episode, I highly recommend you do so. We covered his life and his discoveries in great detail. But tonight, we're going to take on Amerigo Vespucci. He was an Italian discoverer and explorer. He was also a scientist, he was a cartographer, he was an accountant, and he had a very inquisitive mind. And he was actually friends with and colleagues with Christopher Columbus, watched several of his expeditions off. He actually helped him load his ship for his second expedition. And so Amerigo Vespucci started getting very curious and started thinking to himself, I can do some exploration and some discovery expeditions similar to Christopher Columbus one day. In some ways, Columbus was kind of like his hero at the time. And so you can imagine Amerigo Vespucci was building up to this and eventually did get to go on multiple expeditions and discovery missions to the New World. At the time, he thought he was going to the West Indies, similar to Christopher Columbus. They were trying to find a Western route to get to India and Asia. And all of them felt that that's what they were trying to do. And they were trying to find the easiest, most efficient way to do so. What set Amerigo Vespucci apart from everyone else was he realized when he landed on the South American continent that he had discovered a new world. He realized it was a different continent. It was not the West Indies. Christopher Columbus and his men were very confused as to whether it was a new world or not. They thought maybe it could be, or maybe it really had made it all the way to Asia. They really weren't sure. And so, as you can see, Amerigo Vespucci was incredibly important in our history because he was able to change the maps. He was writing home to the European continent through many, many letters, hundreds of letters for each of his expeditions, describing everything he saw, the inhabitants of the lands that he found, the animals, the weather patterns, what it was like to sail through the different straits, some of the dangers that they ran into, the drawings of all the different lands that they found. And so what happened over the course of his first several expeditions was his writings were so vast, so detailed, and included so much, including drawings and maps, that people in the European continent started calling this new world the Americas, after Amerigo Vespucci. And so it started becoming synonymous with his name. So what we're going to talk about tonight is we're going to get into Amerigo Vespucci, his incredible impact. Although he was not first to the South American continent, he came very shortly after Christopher Columbus and in some ways had a much bigger impact because of what we talked about, his changing of the maps, his changing of the world understanding of what was out there, and also his incredible impact on the Age of Discovery. We're going to talk tonight about the first expedition by the Icelandic people to Nova Scotia. We'll talk a little bit about that. Then we're going to talk about the Age of Discovery. We'll touch briefly on Christopher Columbus and his role and impact in the Age of Discovery. You can get the detailed view of that in our episode about Christopher Columbus. And then primarily we're going to get into Amerigo Vespucci and his life and impact. So let's start that now. So what led up to Amerigo Vespucci and his time as the great explorer and discoverer of the Americas? Let's talk through some of the prehistory and then we'll get into his history. So some of the prehistory was there was the Norse colonization of North America. That was the exploration of North America by the Norsemen that began in the 10th century. So this was a full 500 years before Columbus and Vespucci came along as Europeans. Voyages from Iceland first reached Greenland and founded colonies along its western coast of Greenland. Norse settlements in Greenland lasted almost 500 years, and the population peaked at around 2,000 to 3,000 people. The colonies consisted mostly of farms along Greenland's scattered coastal fjords. Colonists relied heavily on hunting, especially walruses and harp seal, and for lumber, they harvested driftwood, imported wood from Europe, and sailed to modern-day Canada to get some of that wood. Actually, looking for wood was one of the reasons they sailed west, and they ran into Nova Scotia and became the first settlers to ever go to what we now know as the New World, which was Nova Scotia, Canada. Architectural evidence indicates that the Greenland colonists used lumber and possibly iron imported from North America back on their ships to go back to Greenland and Iceland and use those materials for their settlements there. Archaeologists found remains of one short-term settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows near the northern tip of Newfoundland. The remains of buildings excavated there were found in the 1960s, dated to approximately 1,000 years ago, so around the 900s. It was not permanent settlement and lacked graves and livestock areas. The site was abandoned, seemingly deliberately, during 1145 AD, with no valuables or tools left behind. Some wood fragments and nuts in the Norse remains were from plants not found in Newfoundland, but native to continental mainland across the Gulf of St. Lawrence. No other settlements in Canada and no other settlements on the North American mainland have been conclusively identified as Norse or Viking. So one of the things they called this land, these Vikings that had found North America, was they called it Vinland. Vinland was an area of the coastal North America that was explored by and settled by the Vikings, specifically Leif Erikson, who landed there just before 1000 AD, nearly 5 centuries before the voyages of Christopher Columbus and John Cabot and Amerigo Vespucci. The name appears in the Vinland sagas and describes a land beyond Greenland. Much of the geographical content of the area sagas correspond to present-day knowledge of the transatlantic travel and North America. During the 1960s, archaeological evidence started to build up as the North site in North America was found and excavated. And as we said before, they're pretty sure now that most of the items they found were either cultivated locally there in Newfoundland, or in some cases were brought across from Greenland and Iceland by these Viking Norse settlers, who did end up leaving in 1145 AD. So that gives you a little bit of history of the early exploration that happened well before the Age of Discovery by the Vikings, who were looking for lumber and other supplies to bring back to Greenland. In terms of the Age of Discovery itself, that occurred in 1418, so this was a full 400 plus years later, and it lasted until 1620. So you're talking about close to 130 years of discovery that was going on by the European powers. It was also known as the Age of Exploration, and was part of the early modern period and largely overlapped with the Age of Sail, it was called. It was a period from approximately the late 15th century to the 17th century, during which seafarers from a number of European countries explored, colonized, conquered, and settled regions across the globe. The Age of Discovery was a transformation period in world history when previously isolated parts of the world became connected to and formed the world system that is laid out today on our maps. The extensive overseas exploration that these discoverers did at the time laid the groundwork for globalization of these great European powers. The extensive overseas exploration, particularly the opening of maritime routes to the Indies and to the European colonization of the Americas by the Spanish and the Portuguese, later joined by the English, the French, and the Dutch, spurred the international global trade routes that are remaining even today. The interconnected global economy of the 21st century has its origins in the expansion of trade networks during this historic era of the Age of Discovery. Exploration also created colonial empires and marked an increased adoption of colonialization as a government policy in several European states. As such, it is sometimes synonymous with the first wave of European colonization. The colonization reshaped power dynamics, causing geopolitical shifts in Europe and creating new centers of power beyond Europe. Having set human history on the global common course, the legacy of the age still shapes the world today. European oceanic exploration started with the maritime expeditions of Portugal to the Canary Islands in 1336, and later with the Portuguese discoveries of the Atlantic archipelagos of Madeira and Azores, the coast of West Africa in 1434, and to the establishment of the sea route to India in 1498 by Vasco da Gama, which initiated the Portuguese maritime trade presence in Kerala and Indian Ocean. During the Age of Discovery, Spain sponsored and financed transatlantic voyages of the Italian navigator Christopher Columbus, which from 1492 to 1504 marked the start of the colonization of the Americas, and the expedition of the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan, and of course to Amerigo Vespucci, who had his own expeditions at the time. These Spanish expeditions significantly impacted the European perceptions of the world. The discoveries led to numerous naval expeditions across the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans, and land expeditions in the Americas, Asias, Africa, and Australia that continued into the 19th century, followed by the exploration of the polar regions in the 20th century. European exploration initiated the Columbus Exchange between Old World Europe and the Americas. This exchange involved the transfer of plants, animals, human populations, communicable diseases, and culture across Eastern and Western hemispheres. The Age of Discovery and European exploration involved mapping the world, shaping a new worldview, and facilitating contact with distant civilizations and peoples. The continents drawn by European mapmakers of the age developed from abstract globes into outlines more recognizable to us today. Simultaneously, the spread of new diseases, especially affecting American Indians, led to rapid population declines in some areas. The era saw widespread enslavement, exploitation, and military conquest of native populations, concurrent with growing economic influence and spread of Western and Eastern European culture. Science and technology leading to faster than exponential population growth worldwide. So that gives you a really good sense for what the age of exploration was during this period from the late 1400s into the early 1600s. It was a very important period, and all the European powers were sending these explorers all over the world to discover what they could find, what they could conquer, and what they could bring back to Europe in terms of wealth and other resources. Let's take a look at Amerigo Vespucci and his background. So Amerigo Vespucci was Italian. He was born March 9th, 1454, and he died February 22nd, 1512. He was an Italian explorer and navigator and scientist from the Republic of Florence, from whom America is named today. Vespucci participated in at least 2 voyages in the Age of Discovery, and possibly a total of 4 voyages that is up for dispute. His 2 voyages that are 100% verifiable happened between 1497 and 1504. First, on behalf of Spain, the 1499 voyage to 1500, and then on behalf of Portugal, the 1501 to 1502 voyage. In 1503 and 1505, 2 booklets were published under his name containing colorful descriptions of these explorations and other voyages. Both publications were extremely popular and widely read throughout much of Europe and made him a household name. Historians still dispute the authorship of these publications and whether he was involved or not. However, they did make him truly famous across the entire continent, maybe the most famous person there was. It raised awareness of discoveries that he had made and his men had made, and enhanced his reputation as Vespucci, as the explorer and navigator that everybody wanted to emulate. Vespucci claimed to have understood in 1501 that Brazil was part of a 4th continent unknown to Europeans, a new world. The claim inspired cartographer Martin Waldseemüller to recognize Vespucci's accomplishments in 1507 in applying the Latinized form of America to the map showing the New World. So you can see Martin took this idea of Amerigo Vespucci, and in 1507 was the first one to affix the name America to this new world and this new set of continents. Other cartographers started to follow suit. securing the tradition of making the name America on maps of the newly discovered continents. It is unknown whether Vespucci was ever aware of these honors in his name, since he died shortly thereafter. In 1505, he was made the subject of Castile by royal decree, and he was appointed to the position of Piloto Major, which is the master navigator for Spain's Casa de Contratación, which is the House of Trade, in Seville in 1508, a post which he held until his death in 1512. In terms of his early career, in 1478, Guido Antonio Vespucci, Amerigo's older uncle, led a Florentine diplomatic mission to Paris and invited his younger cousin, Amerigo Vespucci, with him. Amerigo's role is not clear on this expedition, but likely to be an attaché or a private secretary of some kind to his uncle. Along the way, they had business in Boulogne, Milan, and Lyon. Their objective in Paris was to obtain French support for Florence's war with Naples. Louis XI was non-committal, and the diplomatic mission returned to Florence in 1481 with little to show for their efforts. After his return from Paris, Amerigo worked for a time with his father and continued his studies in science. In 1482, when his father died, Amerigo went to work with Lorenzo de' Medici, head of the junior branch of the Medici family. Although Amerigo was 12 years older, they had been schoolmates under the tutelage of Giorgio Antonio Vespucci. Amerigo served as the household manager and then gradually took on increasing responsibilities, handling various business dealings of the family both at home and abroad. So he was both a businessman, he was an accountant, he was a scientist, he was a cartographer. He was doing a little bit of everything to make ends meet at that time. Meanwhile, he continued to show his interest and support in geography and in overall expeditions. At one point, he bought an expensive map made by the master cartographer Gabriel de Valseca. In 1488, Lorenzo di Parcho became dissatisfied with his Seville business agent, Tommaso Caponi. He dispatched Vespucci to investigate the situation and provide an assessment of the suggested replacement, Florentine merchant Gennaro Bernardi. Vespucci's findings had been lost, but Caponi returned to Florence around this time, and Bernardi took over the Medici business in Seville. In addition to managing Medici's role in Seville, Bernardi had his own business in the African slavery trade and ship chandlery. By 1492, Vespucci had settled permanently in Seville. His motivations for leaving Florence were unclear. He continued to transact some business on behalf of his Medici patrons, but more and more he became involved with Bernardi's other activities, most notably his support of Christopher Columbus's Voyages. Bernardi invested $500,000 in Columbus's first voyage, and he won a potentially lucrative contract to provision Columbus's large second fleet. However, profits proved to be elusive. In 1495, Bernardi signed a contract with the Crown to send 12 resupply ships to Hispaniola, but then died unexpectedly in December without completing the terms of his contract. Vespucci was the executor of Bernardi's will, collecting debts and paying outstanding obligations for the firm. Afterwards, he was left owing $140,000. He continued to provision ships bound for the West Indies, but his opportunities were diminishing. Columbus's expeditions were not providing the hoped profits for the investors of his different enterprises. And his patron, Lorenzo de' Medici, was using other Florentine agents for his business in Seville. Sometime after he settled in Seville, Vespucci married a Spanish woman, Maria Carrezo. Very little is known about her, but Vespucci still refers to her as the daughter of the celebrated military leader Gonzalo de Cordoba. Historian Fernando Ernesto speculates she may have been Gonzalo's illegitimate offspring and a connection that would have been very useful to Vespucci. She was an active participant in his business and held power of attorney for Vespucci when he was away on voyages. So the first voyage alleged by some who write about Vespucci was in 1497 to 1498, and this purports to be an account of Vespucci's voyage to the New World, departing from Spain on May 10th of 1497 and returning on October 15th, 1498. This is perhaps the most controversial of Vespucci's voyages, as this letter is the only known record of its occurrence, and many historians still doubt that this voyage actually took place. Some question the authorship and accuracy of the letter and consider it as a forgery. Others point to the inconsistencies in the narrative of the voyage in what was written in the letter itself, particularly the alleged course, starting near Honduras and proceeding northwest for 187 leagues. Certain earlier historians, including contemporary Bartholomew Las Casas, suspected Vespucci incorporated observations from a later voyage into a fictitious account to this supposed first one, so as to gain primacy over Columbus and position himself as the first European explorer to encounter the mainland Americas. Others, including scholar Alberto Magnani, have suggested that the Sardurni letter was not written by Vespucci at all, but rather by an unknown author who had access to the navigator's private letters and diary. Either way, we'll never really know if this first voyage actually took place and whether Vespucci was involved. The one voyage we do know 100% that he was part of was the voyage from 1499 to 1500. In 1499, Vespucci joined an expedition licensed by Spain and led by Alonso de Ojeda as fleet commander and Juan de la Cosa as chief navigator. Their intention was to explore the coast of the new landmass found by Columbus on his third voyage, and in particular investigate a rich source of pearls that Columbus had reported. Vespucci and his backers financed 2 of the 4 ships in the small fleet. His role in the voyage is not fully clear. Writing later about his experience, however, Vespucci gave the impression that he had a leadership role due to his experience. Instead, he may have served as a commercial representative on the ship on behalf of the fleet's investors. Years later, Ojeda recalled Vespucci as one of the pilots of the expedition, and that he had a much larger role than originally thought. The vessels left Spain on May 18, 1499, and stopped first in the Canary Islands before reaching South America, somewhere near present-day Suriname or French Guiana. From there, the fleet split up. Ojeda proceeded northward towards modern Venezuela with 2 ships, while the other pair headed south with Vespucci aboard. The only record of the southbound journey comes from Vespucci himself. He assumed they were on the coast of Asia and hoped by heading south they would, according to Greek geographer Ptolemy, round the unidentified Cape of Catagara and reach the Indian Ocean. They passed 2 huge rivers, the Amazon and the Para, which poured fresh water 25 miles out to sea. They continued south for another 40 leagues. Forced to turn around, the ships headed north, retracing their course to the original landfall. From there, Vespucci continued up the South American coast to the Gulf of Paria and along the shore of what is now Venezuela. At some point, they may have rejoined Ojeda, but evidence is unclear. In the late summer, they decided to head north for the Spanish colony Hispaniola in the West Indies to resupply, repair their ships before heading home. After Hispaniola, they made a brief slave raid in the Bahamas, capturing 232 Lusayan slaves, and then they returned to Spain. And you can imagine Amerigo Vespucci was such an amazing writer and great documenter of everything that he came back with hundreds and hundreds of letters and his own scripts about everything that had happened on the daily voyage. So the next voyage to talk about is the voyage of 1501. In 1501, Manuel I of Portugal commissioned an expedition to investigate a landmass far to the west in the Atlantic Ocean, encountered unexpectedly by the wayward Pedro Alvarez Cabral on his voyage around Africa to India. That land would eventually become present-day Brazil. The king wanted to know to what extent of this new discovery they could find out about and determine where it lay in relation to the line established by the Treaty of Torsal. Any land that lay in the east of the line could be claimed by Portugal. Vespucci's reputation as an explorer and presumed navigator had already reached Portugal, and he was hired by the king to serve as the pilot under the command of Coleo. Coleo's fleet of 3 ships left Lisbon May of 1501. Before crossing the Atlantic, they resupplied at Cape Verde, where they encountered Cabral on his way home from a voyage to India. This was the same expedition that had found Brazil on its outward journey. Coleo left Cape Verde in June, and from this point, Vespucci's account is the only surviving record of their explorations. On August 17, 1501, the expedition reached Brazil at the latitude of about 6 degrees south. Upon landing, it encountered a hostile band of natives who killed and ate one of his crewmen. Sailing south along the coast, they found friendlier natives and were able to engage in some minor trading. At 23 degrees south, they found a bay which they named Rio de Janeiro because it was January 1st, 1502. On February 13th, 1502, they left the coast to return home. Vespucci estimated their latitude at 32 degrees south, but experts now estimate they were closer to 25 degrees south. Their homeward journey is unclear since Vespucci left a confusing record of the astronomical observations and distance traveled. In 1503, Vespucci may have participated in another expedition for the Portuguese crown, again exploring the east coast of Brazil. There's evidence that this voyage was led by Coleo again, and no independent confirmation that Vespucci took part except for one letter. The only source was this letter that was written by Soderini that said Vespucci was on the ship. Modern scholars dispute Vespucci's authorship of this letter, and it's uncertain whether he actually undertook this trip or not. There's also difficulties with the reported dates. By early 1505, Vespucci was back in Seville. His reputation as an explorer and navigator continued to grow, and he became more and more famous across the continent. His recent service in Portugal did not seem to damage his standing with King Ferdinand at all. On the contrary, the king was likely interested in learning about the possibility of a western passage to India. In February, he was summoned by the king to consult on matters of navigation, and during the next few months, he received payments from the crown for his services, and in April was declared a royal proclamation as a citizen of Castile and Leon. From 1505 until his death in 1512, Vespucci remained in service to the Spanish crown. He continued his work as a chandier, supplying ships bound for the Indies, and he was also hired to captain a ship as part of the fleet bound for the Spice Islands. The planned voyage, however, never took place. In March 1508, he was named chief pilot for the House of Commerce ship that was actually going to be leaving Spain very shortly. He was paid an annual salary of 50,000 maravedis, with an extra 25,000 for expenses. In his new role, Vespucci was responsible for ensuring that ships were adequately trained and licensed before sailing to the New World. He also charged with compiling a model map, the Padrón Real, based on input from pilots who are obligated to share what they learned after each voyage. Vespucci spent over 2 years writing the new, what became the ultimate map that everybody started using all across Europe. And this was the first time in the early 1500s where he started to declare to the king and everybody who would listen that not only had they not gotten to the Indies or to Asia, but that they had discovered a new continent. And he started to talk about all the reasons why this new area was a new continent. Knowledge of Vespucci's voyages relies almost entirely on a handful of letters written by him or attributed to him. 2 of these letters were published during his lifetime and received widespread attention throughout Europe. Several scholars now believe that Vespucci did not write the 2 published letters in the form in which they circulated during his lifetime. They suggest that they were fabrications based in part on genuine Vespucci letters. In 1503, he wrote a letter called Mundus Novus. It was a letter written, originally published in Latin, and the letter described his voyage to Brazil in 1501 and 1502, serving under the Portuguese flag. The document proved to be extremely popular throughout Europe. Within a year of publication, 12 editions were printed, including translations into Italian, French, German, Dutch, and other languages. By 1550, so this was some 40 years after his death, at least 50 editions had been issued, and he was taught in most European schools about Vespucci's incredible voyages. In terms of the 1505 major letter that was very famous, it was called the Letter to Soderini. And it was a letter ostensibly intended for Soderini, the leader of the Florentine Republic. It was written in Italian and published in Florence around 1505. It is more sensational in tone than any of the other letters, and the only one to assert that Vespucci had made 4 voyages of exploration. The authorship and the veracity of the letter have been widely questioned by modern historians. However, about half of historians have actually certified that it is a true letter by Vespucci himself. Nevertheless, this document was an original inspiration for naming the continent in honor of Amerigo Vespucci and calling it the Americas. Some of the remaining documents that were published over the years that were either his work or attributed to his work, Amerigo Vespucci, there was the letter from Seville, which was in 1500, the letter from Cape Verde in 1501 that was written aboard the ship, the letter from Lisbon, 1502, which was a full 21 pages long, and there was the Ridolfi fragment, which was actually from 1502, and this was part of a letter attributed to Vespucci, with some of its assertions remaining very controversial. It was published actually in 1937, so they waited a full 400 years to publish it. It was published by Roberto Ridolfi. The letter appears to be an argumentative response to questions or objections raised by an unknown recipient. A reference is made to 3 voyages made by Vespucci, 2 on behalf of Spain and 1 for Portugal. So you can see all the different disputes about whether he took 2 or 3 or 4 voyages. It was very, very interesting that there was this debate going on about what actually happened. The 2 were actually solidified as proven. The 3rd one, they're fairly certain he took, and the 4th one, they're not so sure. Vespucci has been called the most enigmatic and controversial figure in the early American history. The debate has become known among historians as the Vespucci question. How many voyages did he take? What was his role in those voyages, and what did he learn? The evidence relies almost entirely on a handful of letters that he either wrote or were attributed to him. Many historians have analyzed these documents and have arrived at contradictory conclusions. In 1515, Sebastian Cabot became one of the first to question Vespucci's accomplishments and express doubts about his 1497 voyage and whether it took place. Later, De las Casas argued that Vespucci was a liar and stole the credit that was due of Columbus. By 1600, most regarded Vespucci as an impostor and not worthy of his honors and fame. In 1839, Alexander von Humboldt, after careful consideration, asserted the 1497 voyage was impossible, but accepted the 2 Portuguese-sponsored voyages. Humboldt also called into question the assertion that Vespucci was the one who recognized that he had encountered a new continent and called it a new world. According to Humboldt, Vespucci died in the belief that they had reached the eastern edge of Asia. Vespucci's reputation was perhaps at its lowest in 1856, when Ralph Waldo Emerson called Vespucci a thief and a pickle dealer from Seville who managed to get half the world baptized with his dishonest name. Opinions began to shift, however, after 1857, when Brazilian historian Francisco Adolfo de Werngarten wrote that everything in the Soderini letter was true. Other historians followed in support of Vespucci, including John Fiske and Henry Harissa. In 1924, Alberto Magnati published the results of his exhaustive review of all of Vespucci's writings and pictures and maps, relevant cartography, and other items. He denied Vespucci's authorship of the 1503 Mundus Novus and the 1505 letter to Saturni, the only two texts published during his lifetime. He suggested that the Saturni letter was not written by Vespucci, but was cobbled together by unscrupulous Florentine publishers who combined several accounts into one and called it from Vespucci. Magdinani determined that the manuscript letters were authentic, and based on them, that he was the first to propose the only second and third voyages were true. The first and fourth voyages were actually fabrications. While Magdinani has been one of the chief proponents of the two-voyage narrative, Roberto Levier was an influential Argentinian historian who endorsed the authority and authenticity of Vespucci's letters and proposed the most extensive itinerary for all four of his voyages and certified that all four were true. Other modern historians and popular writers have taken varying positions on Vespucci's letters and voyages, espousing 2, 3, or 4 voyages and supporting or denying the authenticity of 2 of his printed letters. More authors believe that 3 manuscript letters are authentic than don't believe it. While the first voyages were described in the Saturni letter, the most criticism and belief of all. A 2-voyage thesis was accepted and popularized by Frederick J. Pohl in 1944 and rejected by the German press at the time, who posited that all 4 voyages were truthful. Luciano Formiciano also rejects the Nani thesis and said that publishers probably tampered with Vespucci's writings and declared them as true and authenticated. Samuel Morison in 1974 flatly rejected the first voyage, but was non-committal about the 2 published letters. So you can see here that there was a lot of disagreement by everybody who was studying Vespucci, studying the voyages that he took and all of the writings that he left behind. There were quite a few, and all the documents and all the maps that he changed. He did have a humongous impact. Whether he took 2 or 4 voyages, his legacy was huge. His historical importance may rest more with his letters and his maps than anything else. Within a few years of the publication of his 2 letters, the European public became aware of the newly discovered continents of the Americas, which was the biggest impact he did. Essentially, they used his name to call these 2 new continents, and all of Europe now knew about it. According to Vespucci himself, concerning my return from these new regions, which we found and explored, we may rightly call it a new world, because our ancestors had no knowledge of them, and it will be matter wholly new to those who hear about them, for this transcends the view held by our ancients, inasmuch as most of them hold that there is no continent to the south beyond the equator, but only the sea which they named the Atlantic, and if some of them did ever that continent there was, they denied with abundant argument that it was a habitable land. But that was their opinion is false and utterly opposed by the truth. My last voyage was made manifest. For those in the southern parts, I have found a continent more densely peopled and abounding in animals than Europe or Asia or Africa combined. In addition, the climate milder and more delightful than in any other region known to us, as you shall learn in my following account. So that was one of the last things Vespucci actually wrote himself in his letter, talking about his now belief after his voyages that they had discovered a new world that was not Europe or Asia. So very interesting there. You can see a little background behind Vespucci, behind his different accomplishments, his voyages, and all the other things that he did to have a humongous impact on the world, as you can see. Let's go ahead and take a look at this video, and we'll come back and talk about it on the other side.
An Italian geographer and explorer named Amerigo Vespucci was the first person to realize that the land across the Atlantic was not, in fact, Asia. It was a new world, which years later would be named in his honor as America. In 1496, Vespucci, a businessman who dabbled in the shipping industry, met Christopher Columbus in Seville, Spain. Struck by Columbus's tales of adventure and wealth in the West Indies, Vespucci, although more than 40 years old, decided to become an explorer and see the exotic lands for himself. Securing a position as a mapmaker and astronomer for a Spanish expedition, he departed from Cadiz in 1499. Vespucci reached the Americas and sailed south, becoming the first European to sail across the equator in New World waters. As he explored the South American coast, which he thought was India, Vespucci saw a shoreline of dense forest. Unable to land, he continued sailing until making another stunning discovery: fresh water. Although he thought he had reached the Ganges River of India, Vespucci actually reached the enormous mouth of the Amazon River. He navigated up the Amazon, and, as he later recounts in a letter, he observed an infinite number of birds of various forms and colors, and trees so beautiful and fragrant that we thought we had entered the earthly paradise. He also spotted a snake 8 times longer than a man's arm and as wide as a man's waist. Frightened by the serpent, Vespucci and his crew returned to the sea and sailed home. In 1501, he returned to South America on a Portuguese expedition to explore even more of the mysterious coast. On this journey, he discovered the site now called Rio de Janeiro, as well as the La Plata River in Argentina and Uruguay. After deeper investigation of the native people, flora, and fauna, he concluded that this land was not, in fact, India or any part of Asia. Vespucci was convinced that it was an entirely different land, a 4th continent, which he called the New World. While he was far below the equator, Vespucci realized that he couldn't sail by the North Star because it wasn't high enough in the sky for traditional navigation. Instead, he depended on stars and constellations that only shone in the southern hemisphere. Vespucci mapped Alpha and Beta Centauri and the Southern Cross, stars that would guide future explorers of the southern hemisphere for centuries. Each night, Vespucci also observed the conjunction of the planets with the moon and compared the actual time of conjunction to the anticipated time listed in astronomical charts. From these celestial calculations, Vespucci determined how far west he had sailed, the width of the Atlantic Ocean, and thus that the Earth was 25,000 miles around, greater than Columbus's previous estimate of 20,000 miles. Those extra 5,000 miles validated Vespucci's theory that another continent could fit between Europe and Asia. In 1507, a European mapmaker labeled the southern portion of the New World as America, in honor of Vespucci's realization that the Americas were a continent distinct from Asia. Back in Spain in 1508, Vespucci was awarded the office of Master Navigator. For the remainder of his life, he recruited and trained other navigators for further exploration of America. In 1538, 26 years after Vespucci died, another mapmaker marked the name America on both the northern and southern halves of the continent, cementing Vespucci's legacy as the namesake of the New World.
Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian explorer, navigator, and cartographer, holds a prominent place in the history of the Age of Exploration. He is credited with recognizing that the lands colonized by Christopher Columbus were not part of Asia, as initially believed, but a new world. Vespucci's voyages, writings, and influence on cartography contributed to the naming of the Americas, securing his legacy as one of the most significant figures in the exploration of the Western Hemisphere. Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian, relocated to Spain and became involved in outfitting ships for exploration. He worked closely with explorers like Columbus, gaining first-hand knowledge of the burgeoning age of exploration. This experience paved the way for Vespucci to undertake his own voyages. Vespucci's relationship with Columbus was both professional and influential, albeit marked by contrasting paths and perspectives. Vespucci and Columbus were contemporaries operating within the same Spanish maritime circles, and their interactions reflected the dynamic and competitive nature of the Age of Exploration. When Vespucci arrived in Spain in the late 1490s, Columbus had already made his first voyage to the New World and was celebrated as the discoverer of new lands. Vespucci worked as a supplier of ships and provisions for expeditions, a role that likely brought him into direct contact with Columbus. Their collaboration was practical, with Vespucci learning about navigation and exploration strategies from Columbus's experiences. While Columbus firmly believed that the lands he encountered were part of Asia, though not India, as popularly believed today, Vespucci's later voyages led him to challenge this assertion. Columbus referred to the people he encountered as los hijos en Dios, meaning children of God, which was later misunderstood by the English as Indians. In fact, the term India was not even part of the Spanish language in 1492, and did not become common until the English popularized the term centuries later. Vespucci's exploration of the South American coastline convinced him that these lands were part of a separate continent, which he famously referred to as the New World. This divergence in perspective created a subtle rivalry. Columbus's achievements were rooted in his initial discovery, but Vespucci's recognition of the New World as distinct from Asia reshaped European understanding of geography. The differences in their interpretations contributed to the broader debate about the nature of the newly discovered territories. Despite their differing conclusions, Vespucci and Columbus shared a mutual influence. Vespucci's observations benefited from the early explorations by Columbus, and his subsequent voyages expanded upon the regions first encountered by Columbus. Their collective efforts, though not always aligned, were instrumental in the European exploration and eventual colonization of the Americas. Columbus is celebrated as the discoverer of the New World, while Vespucci is remembered for identifying it as a distinct landmass. Their legacies, while intertwined, represent different aspects of exploration. Columbus as the bold pathfinder, and Vespucci as the analytical observer, who provided a new framework for understanding the discoveries. This distinction ultimately led to the naming of the continents after Vespucci, a decision that has sparked debates among historians about the relative importance of his contributions. Vespucci's first voyage is shrouded in controversy due to limited and conflicting evidence. According to letters attributed to Vespucci, he sailed under Spanish sponsorship and explored parts of the Caribbean and Central America. The voyage reportedly reached areas near present-day Venezuela, but historians debate the authenticity of these accounts. Some even suggest that this voyage may have been fabricated or misattributed. In any case, Vespucci described an encounter he had with Arawak from the Caribbean island of Curacao in 1497. A number of Arawak came swimming over the sea and approached us, joining others who had arrived in canoes. Then some old women appeared at the doors of the huts, uttering great cries and tearing out their hair in sign of grief. This made us suspect something, and each man seized his weapon. Suddenly, some Arawak in canoes came nearer and began to shoot with their bows and arrows. The Arawak who were swimming had each brought a lance, concealed under the water as much as possible. As soon as we understood the treachery, we not only defended ourselves from them, but also attacked them vigorously and sank many of their canoes with our ships. Thus we routed and slaughtered them, and all took to swimming, abandoning their canoes. Having suffered enough damage, they swam back to the shore. Nearly 15 or 20 of them were killed, and many more were wounded. His second voyage, confirmed by multiple sources, was undertaken under Spanish patronage. Vespucci joined an expedition led by Alonso de Ojeda, exploring the northeastern coast of South America. During this journey, Vespucci is believed to have reached the mouth of the Amazon River and observed the vastness of the continent. His detailed descriptions of the land, flora, fauna, and indigenous peoples highlighted the uniqueness of this territory. One significant contribution of this voyage was Vespucci's observation of the stars in the southern hemisphere, including the constellations unseen from Europe. These celestial observations played a crucial role in navigation and further distinguished his reports from those of Columbus. Sponsored by Portugal, Vespucci embarked on his third and most important voyage. Sailing along the eastern coast of South America, he traveled farther south than any previous European explorer, possibly reaching as far as present-day Patagonia. During this voyage, Vespucci became convinced that the landmass he explored was not part of Asia, but a previously unknown continent. Vespucci's letters from this voyage are particularly significant, as they describe the rich biodiversity, indigenous cultures, and the immense size of the continent. He suggested that the newly discovered lands be called the New World, a term that underscored the departure from the old Eurasian landmass. One of the most sensational aspects of Vespucci's writings is his claim that certain groups practiced cannibalism. He described in vivid detail how warriors would consume the flesh of their enemies as part of rituals. These accounts, whether exaggerated or misinterpreted, contributed to the European perception of Native Americans as savages, justifying colonization and missionary efforts. On his final expedition, Vespucci returned to Brazil under Portuguese sponsorship. This voyage focused on further exploration of the South American coastline and gathering valuable trade goods such as Brazil wood. Vespucci's reports continued to emphasize the distinctiveness of the New World, further cementing the idea of a separate continent. Vespucci's contributions to cartography stem from his detailed observations and reports of the New World. His descriptions of geography, climate, and navigation were incorporated into maps that reshaped European understanding of the Western Hemisphere. The Mundus Novus letter, published in 1504, was a pivotal document in shaping the European view of the New World. In this letter, Vespucci articulated his belief that the lands he explored were part of a new continent. The 30-page letter was widely circulated and translated into multiple languages, reaching an audience eager for news of the discoveries. The most significant recognition of Vespucci's contributions came from the German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller. In 1507, Waldseemüller published a world map titled Universalis Cosmographia, which was the first to label the new continent America in honor of Amerigo Vespucci. Waldseemüller's decision was based on Vespucci's letters and the realization that he had correctly identified the New World as a separate landmass. Following Waldseemüller's map, the name America gradually became accepted for both continents, North and South America. Meanwhile, Vespucci's observations continued to inform cartographic depictions, especially of the South American coastline. The naming of the Americas after Vespucci was both a reflection of his contributions and a historical coincidence. While Columbus had made the initial discovery of the New World, Vespucci's writings played a crucial role in spreading the understanding that these lands were not part of Asia. This recognition distinguished Vespucci among explorers and ensured his name would be immortalized. Some historians argue that Vespucci's contributions were overstated and that his letters may have been embellished. Nevertheless, his role in advancing the geographic understanding of the New World is undeniable. Vespucci was appointed chief navigator for Spain in 1508, a position that reflected his expertise and influence. The enduring legacy of his name on the continents of North and South America is a testament to his impact on exploration and cartography. Regarding the native peoples, Vespucci would write with a mixture of condescension and admiration that the women are extraordinarily lusty, yet their bodies are attractive. They are as wild as can be imagined. They have no hair whatsoever on their bodies, and they have very long black hair, which beautifies them. They are gifted with very well-proportioned bodies, and no part is to be seen that is not well-formed. They are of a free and good-looking expression of countenance, which they themselves destroy by boring the nostrils and lips, the nose and ears. Nor must you believe that the borings are small, nor that they only have one, for I have seen those who had no less than 7 borings in the face, each one the size of a plum. They fill these perforations with blue stones, bits of marble, of crystal, or very fine alabaster, also with very white bones and other things artificially prepared, according to their customs, which if you could see, it would appear a strange and monstrous thing. Vespucci wrote that one man had in the nostrils and lips alone 7 stones, of which some were half a palm in length. It will astonish you to hear that I considered that the weight of 7 such stones was as much as 16 ounces. In each ear they had 3 perforations bored, whence they had other stones and rings suspended. This custom is only for the men, as the women do not perforate their faces, but only their ears, concluded the awe-struck Vespucci. Vespucci's accounts of the indigenous peoples he encountered provide a fascinating perspective on the cultures of the New World. While some details are considered exaggerated or embellished, they offer valuable insights into early European perceptions of Native Americans. Vespucci often marveled at the physical strength and endurance of the indigenous peoples. He described their excellent health, which he attributed to the warm climate, and noted their impressive adaptation to their environment. According to his accounts, the natives lived in well-constructed communal houses and practiced agriculture, fishing and hunting with remarkable skill. Vespucci's observations of women's beauty were often laced with idealized notions. He described them as naturally beautiful and noted their use of body art, such as tattoos or painted designs, to enhance their appearance. These descriptions fascinated his European audience, who often romanticized the exoticism of the New World. His descriptions of women often highlighted their role in the community. Vespucci noted that women were industrious and played a vital role in maintaining the social and economic fabric of their societies. He observed that they were responsible for cultivating crops, preparing food, and crafting tools and garments. In some regions, women also participated in trade and were skilled in making decorative items from local resources, such as shells, feathers, and beads. Native women's roles in religious and cultural practices were also noted. Vespucci described ceremonies where women played central roles, either as participants in dances or as caretakers of sacred objects. He observed that women were often regarded as life-givers and caretakers of the earth, which aligned with some of their spiritual beliefs about nature and fertility. Vespucci also described the role of women in times of war. He observed that while men were primarily involved in combat, women supported warriors by preparing food and weapons. In some instances, women were described as fighting alongside men, a testament to their resilience and bravery. While Vespucci admired the ingenuity and resilience of indigenous peoples, his writings also reflect the views of his time. He frequently contrasted their uncivilized ways with European norms, framing their societies as inferior, but capable of being improved through Christianization and European influence. Amerigo Vespucci's Voyages to the New World, his detailed writings about indigenous peoples, and his contributions to cartography cemented his place in history as one of the most influential figures of the Age of Exploration.
As you can see there from the video, the incredible impact that Vespucci had. He was able to essentially create a narrative for the European continent that they hadn't thought about, which was that Columbus and other explorers, including himself, had discovered a new world, a new continent that had not existed before in any of the original maps, and that existed in between Europe and in between Asia if you went west. And this was a completely new concept. And he, through his writings, and because he was such a great writer, was able to fascinate all of Europe with his accounts of the individuals he ran into, the dangers, the animals, the human beings, the plants, and all the other things that he discovered on his different voyages to South America and Central America. The plants that they ran into, the types of foods that they tried, the cultures that they were able to discover, the incredible weather that they were seeing, and that one of the reasons they thought everybody there that they had run into were so strong and so vibrant and healthy. And so Vespucci was perfectly positioned at this time and was one of the few people that, when he came across and then came back to Europe, was able to explain through the written word, and with his scientific knowledge, with his cartography background and ability to draw and alter maps. He really had all the skills you would ever want to be able to be a true explorer and discoverer of a new world, and was able to go back and translate that for the European continent. And of course, this is why his writings became so famous, and in our current days, we would say went viral with the people of Europe, and why the continent of South America, Central America, and North America are now called America, after his first name, Amerigo. So hopefully you learned a lot there about Amerigo Vespucci. You learned a lot about his background, his impact, what he was able to do. If you think about it, this was his second career. In his early career, he was an accountant and he ran businesses, and he was an agent for different types of businesses. He was assisting Columbus to get his voyages underway and helping him load his ships. And so he undertook something in his 40s to take on something new, which was to become a discoverer, to become someone who would go on these voyages and be able to map the new world for Europe and be able to explain to them what had been found and what had been discovered on behalf of Spain and Portugal. So hopefully you enjoyed that. You learned a lot about Amerigo Vespucci. You can see him as one of the lesser known voyagers at that time, lesser known than Columbus, who got all the credit for being the first. Reality is that Amerigo was able to document much more than Columbus, and he was able to really discover and surmise for the first time that this was a new world. This was not Asia, but it was something else. It was a new continent that had never been explored before. And he was able to actually translate that onto a real map that then allowed him to associate his name with this new continent, the Americas. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel. We have many more great episodes coming your way, and definitely dig into a little bit more Amerigo Vespucci. Read some of his writings. I'll drop some links in the comments down below for you to take a look at his writings if you'd like to read them directly. They're really fascinating when he talks about the different countries he discovered. And we'll see you next time on Traveling Through History. Have a great night.